Hey, I'm Allison from Learning at the Primary Pond. I'm a literacy specialist, and in this video, I'm going to explain the difference between summarizing and retelling. There is a difference, and it does matter. I'm also going to give you practical ways to teach and work on summarizing and retelling, and that will really help your students' comprehension. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell so that you're notified every time I post a brand new video about teaching literacy in K2. Okay, so let's start with the basic definition or definitions. Number one, retelling is when students tell you about a text and they include everything. So they're pretty much including all the details and some of the main ideas. Summarizing, on the other hand, is when students tell you about a text in a more concise manner. So they're not necessarily including all the details, they're just focusing on the main ideas or what is most important. Now, both of these skills can be tricky for students. So right now I have a question for you. Have you ever asked students for a retelling or a summary, and then they either on one end of the scale, they leave out tons of important information and maybe it's just very like surface level, or on the other end of the scale, they are practically reading straight from the text, word for word. They go back to the text and they're just reading you things, or, it's like they're really not putting anything in their own words. If you've ever had kids on either end of the spectrum, right now in the comments, type the word relate so that other teachers know that they are not alone if this has happened to them. It has definitely happened to me. Okay, so now let's dig a little bit deeper into the differences between retelling and summarizing. For a retelling, it's important the kids learn not to leave out any of the details, and this includes characters and the plot line. So like the main events in the story, or, if it's nonfiction, basically everything that the author has told them about the text. Now, with a summary, there's more like higher level thinking involved. The student has to synthesize all the details and express everything in their own words, but also concisely. So with the example of a fiction text, this means that maybe only the main characters are mentioned, not like every single character, and the plot highlights are mentioned, but not every single little event in the story. That would be more of like a retelling, right? And there is more subjectivity when you're talking about summarizing because it's up to the reader to decide what details are most important. So you could have different kids coming up with summaries that are slightly different, and as long as you feel that they've come up with like the most important parts of the text, that's okay. It's okay if there's slight differences. Now, let's talk about why you need to teach these skills. Number one, having students retell helps them clear up misunderstandings, and also helps you recognize misunderstandings that they have about the text. So maybe there's an incorrect plot line, maybe they're confusing characters and what they did, so it can kind of reveal those inaccuracies that can lead to some really valuable discussion. Retelling and summarizing also help a reader just better understand a text and also remember it. There are real life opportunities when you would want to tell somebody else the gist of what you read, whether it's a long email or, if it's an actual like novel that you read. So this has real life applications, and it also helps them improve their comprehension as, they're working on it as readers. So now let's talk about when and how to teach these skills. So retelling, that is simpler, right? A child pretty much at any age can begin to learn how to retell a story. So we teach retelling before we teach summarizing, which makes sense, right? Because retelling is, it's just restating what happened in the text, and there's no like synthesizing or making things concise. So if we start with kindergarten, have them go back to the beginning of the book, have them turn page by page, have them use the pictures or the photos to retell what was going on in the text, right? And at that age, they don't need to be necessarily decoding any of the words. If they can read, great. But again, you don't want them like reading straight from the text. You're just using the pictures, whatever, to retell. I do, when I'm working on this skill in kindergarten, retelling that is, I encourage kids to use the character name. Sometimes they just say like he or she or they, but actually have them use the character names. Make sure they include the setting and, you know, simple sequence words like first, next, and last. And of course, this is going to take time. It's going to take modeling. You could have a little checklist that shows them, you know, these are the things that you need to include in your retelling. And the beautiful thing about retelling is that, you know, you can do it pretty much with any text. So it's something that you can practice again and again in whole group, in small group, even one-on-one a little bit. So now with first and second graders, they get into more complex text. Maybe the texts are a little bit longer. So students at this point should not necessarily be going like looking on every single page like they might be in kindergarten in order to retell. So depending on how the text is set up, you know, 1 to 2 retelling sentence might cover a few different pages in the text, and that's okay. Students should also be weaving in addition to like characters and setting, assuming it's fiction, they should be weaving in problem and solution into the retelling in a natural way. So again, that, you know, might be a checklist that you kind of give them. These are the things that we want to cover in our retelling. So that could also be an anchor chart, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a checklist that they each have. It could be something that you display in the classroom. And then as far as like giving them feedback and having them practice, of course, they can retell to themselves after they read a text. They can retell in a group when you're doing like a whole group lesson, but also, you know, when you're doing a whole group lesson, in order to give them more opportunities to retell as opposed to just calling on like a few kids, you might have them retell to a partner. So like a turn and talk activity. Maybe you only retell half of the story at a time. You break it down. So we've read half the story, now turn to your partner and retell. Now we'll finish the story and then we do a retell for the rest of it. Because sometimes retelling the story as a whole or the text as a whole at first might be a lot for them. So it's okay to break it down, and it's a good idea to have them do a little bit of partner work. You can do that partner work in a small group or guided reading setting as well. Really, the more opportunities they have, the better. So that's why we want them doing as much as possible. And it's okay to have the class work together to do a retelling, but we want each individual child to have lots of practice in addition to that. You can also teach kids, again, it takes some time and some modeling, but you can teach them how to provide feedback to their partners. So for example, you might teach them to say, okay, you know, you did a great job, blank, including all of the characters' names. Next time, tell me about the setting. So they can use that anchor chart or they can use that checklist, and their partner can give them some feedback on their retelling, which is really good. And even the partner, like it helps the partner who is giving the feedback practice retelling too, because they have to think, you know, what are the different parts that they should have included. Okay, so another thing you can have them do, I meant to bring along an example and I didn't, but a graphic organizer. So imagine just like a very basic graphic organizer with like beginning, a box for beginning, middle, end, and, you know, you can have them just like touch each box and retell. You could also have them draw a picture and retell. You can eventually have them write words and retell, but graphic organizers can just be a good reminder to cover that beginning, middle, and end, and they don't have to be fancy. Just a box for beginning, a box for middle that might be a little bit bigger, because usually there's more happening in the middle of a story anyway, and then the end. So that's retelling, right? It's going to take some time. It's going to take some practice. An interesting thing to note is that you might have a kid who's like proficient in retelling, and then you introduce a more challenging or complex text, and it looks like they're not good with retelling, but it's really just because the difficulty level of the text has increased. So we continue to retell even after we see like, oh, kids, you know, are doing okay with it. However, then we also want to build into summarizing. This is not something that I really expect the kids to do in kindergarten. Some first graders may be ready for it, but it does require like the higher order thinking skills of determining importance. And I like to think of summarizing as like a movie trailer version of a retelling. When you watch a movie trailer, it might have like, well, hopefully it won't reveal all of the good parts, right? But it'll kind of have like the highlights, and it won't have, you know, every single little detail, because then otherwise why would you want to watch the movie? But what you can do with your kiddos is to actually have them pretend that they have some kind of audience for this. And, you know, you can actually give them an audience too. That's a really authentic way to practice summarizing, but tell them, okay, you've got an audience and your audience only has a short amount of time to hear what the text is about. So in limiting them, the kids learn that, not every single detail can be included in what they're telling them. You could literally time it, right? And they have a certain amount of time for their partner. Like, of course, don't rush them in preparing their summary, but limit the amount of time when they're actually allowed to talk. Maybe they've each read a book independently, different books, and they take some time to prepare a summary, and then you time them and they have to retell in a limited amount of time. Graphic organizers too. Again, I know I forgot to bring them, but retelling would be like beginning, middle, end. You could do something like characters, setting, problem, solution as well. But with summarizing, it could be helpful to have some kind of like T-chart where there's one column for like important details and then details that are interesting. Because sometimes kids will just want to tell you like, oh yeah, and this happened, even though it's not the most important thing in the text. So you can say, you're right, that did happen. Let's put that into interesting details, even though it's not one of the most important details. So that is the skill of determining importance, which really ties into summarizing. So let's go over an example of this from The Three Little Pigs, right? That's a story that most of us know. So an example of an important detail from this story is the material used for each type of house. That's relevant because the type of material determined whether the wolf was going to be able to blow it down, right? So an example of an interesting detail though, so that was important detail, the material. An example of an interesting detail that we wouldn't necessarily include in the summary is that the pig's mother asked them to build houses. You don't necessarily need to know as the audience, if you've never heard this story before, that the pig's mother is who asked them to build the houses, right? In a summary, hopefully I've been saying summary and not retell, but in a summary, we just basically need to know the main plot points, and it's mostly about the wolf like trying to blow the houses down. The pig's mother, interesting detail, but not the most important. So hopefully that example gives you one idea of how you would help kids differentiate between interesting details and those that are truly important. Now, it is common for students to struggle with this, right? Both with retelling and summarizing. A little bit earlier in the video, we talked about like chunking text. So maybe we only do the first half and then the last half. You can break it down even further. Break it down into quarters, break it down into pages. Go to the smallest chunk of text where kids can be successful with retelling or summarizing, even if it's only like a page or two, right? And there's not much text on those pages. That is okay. It is okay to break it down into chunks, especially when they're learning or if they're struggling. So I'm going to read you now some prompts that you might use for getting kids to retell. So number one, you might say, what happened first in the story, what happened next, and what happened last, right? So you're kind of guiding them and talking about those three parts. How did the story begin? What were the names of the characters in the story? Where did the story take place? Was there anything wrong for the characters in the story? So getting at the problem. How did the story end? Look at the picture. Tell me what's happening in the picture. That can get them, talking about it. Reread this page, then tell me what happened on this page. So those are all good prompts for getting kids to retell. And then if students are literally just rereading the story to you instead of retelling, the prompt that you might say is, right now, I hear you reading the author's words. That's good that you're paying attention to the author's words. But what I want you to do is tell me about the story in your own words. You can actually have them physically close the text. You can model a little bit, right? So that they're not tempted to use the author's words verbatim. Again, the text is a good tool, so give them a minute to look back through, okay, tell me when you're ready to retell, then they close it and then they retell, and that stops them from literally reading from the text. Now, with summarizing, you might ask them, okay, is that an important detail or is that an interesting detail? Of course, after we've done that T-chart and practice differentiating between the two. Number two, tell me quickly what the text is about. You might also say something like, assuming it's fiction, so far you've told me about the plot, but you haven't mentioned anything about the character names. Try telling me about the plot again, but mention the characters' names this time. Another thing you can do for summarizing is typically, at least in a fiction story, the strong emotion points in a story will indicate important plot events. So like you could say something like, okay, think about the different feelings that this character felt during the text. They might say that, first he was sad, then blah, blah, excited, whatever. Okay, now tell me your summary or write your summary and make sure to include all those emotion points because that's a good way for them to figure out like what is most important or at least plot wise. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Again, be patient with yourself, be patient with your kids, do lots of modeling, both of these strategies or both these skills. Both these strategies take time to become skills, right? A strategy becomes a skill when kids are no longer like actively working to apply it and it just kind of becomes secondhand for them. So that's what we're working toward. I do have a reading comprehension strategies curriculum for kindergarten and first grade that may be helpful to you. Look for the link below so you can get access and learn more. Thanks so much for watching. Again, I hope that this was helpful. Hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.